Hey there, thank you for tapping over to this episode of Coast to Coast. There have been a lot of reasons that have both been built and taken for granted that end up ranking the US at such an advantage globally. One to me that tends to get most unnoticed, perhaps because it is the one that is most obvious, is the geography. Yes, we have friendly neighbors to the north and south that give the United States an advantage over most places. They have to worry about rivalries or ethnic strife or historical axes to grind. The oceans also flank the other sides, certainly helping it as well, and further the point of how little geography tends to get considered. But within the country, from coast to coast and border to border, there's a broad range of climates, resources, even cultures that give the country an advantage. One of those advantages within the country, a staggering advantage, that has largely been left to rot, which is ironic given that before there was a sweeping amount of rail lines, or even the invention of a truck, let alone airplanes, this advantage was meticulously expanded by hand over vast miles, and without which I think I could easily argue the country couldn't have become such a powerhouse of regional specialization. It's not sexy, but fundamentals rarely, if ever, are. But if it's an advantage that's not only built the progress on which we stand on, but one that can further causes going ahead in the present and can affect everything from transportation to emissions reduction. Okay, enough of a buildup. One of the greatest assets the US has and is going to waste is our navigable waterways. The rivers, lakes, and canals, even shorelines on the ocean that connect together, are big and deep enough for ships to traverse, which stretch out over a meaningful distance. So navigable waterways, in short, places that we could put ships on to move things. Let me give you some numbers to put this in somewhat of a perspective, even though numbers are hard to visualize. The US has about 40,000 kilometers of inland waterways. The second most country in the world, Finland, has 8,100. Think about that. 8,000 versus 40,000. You don't need to know the conversion of what kilometers are to miles to understand that's staggering. No other country comes close to the potential to move things on the most efficient form of transportation pound for pound. Let me digress in that for a second. Think about it. Have you ever spent time in a boat and see how when you're moving around from the dock, a single person can push or move around a speedboat to slide it into place with some effort, but it's a single person moving a giant boat. Why is that? Well, eureka, it's buoyancy. The floating of the boat on the water makes shifting the weight easier to move around. The same holds true for a barge full of grain going down the Mississippi. It's a lot more efficient to move that grain down water than it would be by truck or plane or hell, even rail. But alas, we can't escape physics, not yet at least. And water still takes the crown as the easiest, most efficient way to move things. It's not faster, but not everything needs speed, and it would have lower costs, higher reliability, and from there, more can be sorted out. That efficiency from physics, also tied with modern technology, can create ships that emit far less, and would be a net emissions reduction from trucks, which account for the majority of transportation today. And if we were actually leaning into moving things by ship, we'd be able to figure out some of the logistics. Moving things maybe the last bit on trucks. Or moving things that make sense by rail and the rest by boat. Majority of Americans live not all that far from either a navigable waterway or the coastline. Yet, we're not taking advantage of this. So we have an environmental and a business win. Then why is this opportunity being left to rot? If you haven't heard my other episode on this topic, the reason is the Jones Act, a century-plus old law that forbids ships from operating within the U.S. if they are not made in the US and crewed by US citizens. A bill that on the face of it looks to be protectionist. One could even see it being argued by the national security angle. But oh, how those unintended consequences love to crop up. And this Jones Act ends up being the opposite of any of those arguments. As this episode unfolds, you'll see how the nuances of the law require specifics on the bill down to the steel being put together, requiring an act of Congress in one case to pass a resolution to be able to finish the completion of a boat. Or how tragic the irony of the build clause is writ large, given that most of the components needed for the building of a ship come from overseas. But the best example of how something plays out is always in the experience of it. And there's many of those that lend useful laboratories for how different things would be without this requirement. Like the Great Lakes, juxtaposing the US and Canada, or Puerto Rico versus Trinidad, or even New England versus the rest of the world. The Jones Act is a truly horrendous handicap on a great opportunity that the US has. Not just the inland waterways, but the number of Americans who live just 100 miles off the coast. In this episode, Colin Grabow from the Cato Institute joins me again to give us a bit of an update on the state of the Jones Act since we last talked. And spoiler alert, unfortunately not much has changed, other than some logistic nightmares from COVID that give more credence to ending the law. We talk about those logistics, the massive missed opportunity, what it would look like if the Jones Act was not in place, with some helpful examples to prove it out, and why it is the Jones Act can't just be repealed. If you want to know more, follow Colin's work linked in the description. Also check out our other episode on the Jones Act that goes more into what it was and how it was formed, which is episode 26 in this season, or on the Sugar Cartel, episode 22, also with Colin. Which, fun fact, the United States operates a cartel for sugar. All right, with that, thank you for listening. Enjoy the episode wherever it is that you are on our big, beautiful blue planet. I'm wishing you well. Hey, real quick while I have you here. If you like what you're listening to, please tap that follow or subscribe, as well as sign up for notifications so you'll know when our next season or episode drops. Also, if you're curious to look at our catalog of all that we have to offer and some exciting things we have to come, please visit us at bandwidth.productions. Sweet. Okay, cool. Well, thank you again. I know it's been, I think we were saying like a year and a half. So I'm going to ask a question just to kind of get us into it, and then we'll start talking about all the great things of the Jones Act, which is, what is your favorite food?
My favorite food. That is a good question. Um, well, so my wife is Spanish, so I'm kind of biased towards food from Spain. Um, oh my goodness. So I don't know about a particular dish, but I do like, I don't know, a genre or whatever. I like as far as type of cuisine. I like Spanish cuisine, kind of just Mediterranean uh, food. Um, but yeah, no, I'll say apple pie is my favorite food.
I dig that. That's
Uh,
totally
and my wife, living here in the U.S., she's actually learned to bake an apple pie, and she does it quite well. So on special occasions, I get an apple pie.
that is, there's nothing wrong with that. It's very American, which is awesome because we're going to be talking about America a lot. But I mean, there's something about apple pie that when you have it at the right time, it's just amazing, especially when it's warm and fresh. We were talking right before that you said that the Great Lakes, which I'm particularly fond of, uh, hasn't had a ship. So what I'll do really quick, just so that this can be a standalone, is explain what the Jones Act is, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about, and then I'll go back on with my question, which feel free to alter any of the definition of the Jones Act. So the Jones Act, early 1900s. there is a ban on any shipping that is done inside the United States to be done by a ship that is crewed and created. So I guess the vessel was I don't know what do you call it when you create a ship? Is there a specific term for it?
So the Jones Act to transport goods by water in the United States to comply with the Jones Act, the vessels used have to be American flagged, have to be American built, have to be American crewed, and they have to be American owned.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. So, uh, it seems like a good idea. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but the ripples of it is obviously quite problematic. So you were saying that the Great Lakes, which is huge, I think we kind of take it for granted in America just how amazing and large and an asset the Great Lakes are. But you had mentioned that for the first time in 38 years, the Great Lakes got a ship, a new ship added to it. Which, if you could let us know why that's such a long time, especially considering some of the new advancements and new ships that have been happening in Canada, and how old, and integral is the Great Lakes, shipping fleet itself.
Yes. So the Jones Act obviously it applies to the Great Lakes as well. So if you want to transport goods within the Great Lakes, so for example, taking taconite to the steel mills elsewhere in the Great Lakes. So the raw inputs that go to the steel mills that has to go on Jones Act compliant ships. And Jones Act compliant ships on the Great Lakes, so U.S. flagged, U.S. built ships, tend to be very old. Part of this is because they operate in fresh water. Fresh water is less caustic, doesn't take as much of a toll on the ship as salt water does. But even so, the ages of these vessels are really something. There hasn't been a new, last year there was a new ship delivered for the Great Lakes fleet, and it was the first new ship delivered since I believe 1983. So 1983 to 2022, so yeah, but almost 40 years without a new ship. Now, what's interesting is we kind of have a natural experiment going on the Great Lakes, and that the Great Lakes is also bordered by Canada. So there's a Canadian fleet there. Now, Canada, back in, I want to say 2012, something like this, around 2010, they used to have a 25% tariff on imports of new ships, and they got rid of that. And what happened? Canadians started modernizing their fleets, and there have been numerous new ships added to the Canadian fleet over the last decade, whereas the U.S. fleet has gotten one new ship. So, this has obvious implications for efficiency. Newer ships, they tend to have newer technologies that make them more efficient to operate. They tend to be more environmentally friendly with lower emissions, better fuel efficiency. So we have this natural experiment going on where the Canadians are getting lots of new ships and Americans are not. And I think a very obvious reason here is the Jones Act, because to comply with the Jones Act, the ships have to be built in the United States. Unfortunately, US shipbuilders are much less efficient, much less competitive than those found in other countries. This is kind of predictable. When you protect industries like this, they don't have to compete, they become uncompetitive, dramatically so. Now, I don't know about Great Lakes ships in particular, but for ocean going ships, U.S. tankers are 4 times more than those built abroad. Container ships could cost 5 times more. And when you're talking assets that cost tens of millions of dollars, so instead of costing say $50 million for a new ship, you have to pay 200 million or more. That has a real deterrent effect on modernizing your fleet and buying new ships. So the result is these guys just tend to hang on to old ships for longer and repair them rather than move on and recapitalize and get newer vessels.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I have a question of like clarification and just kind of like if this situation would apply to it. So, it what seems like forever ago, sometime after we had last talk, actually, there was the huge port of LA bottleneck, right? So there was, cargo ships coming in that were hanging out in the port of LA for way too long. Now, those ships could they have gone to Florida Or could you have, because the other thing too that I was noticing from that is that they were taking the cargo and they were bringing it far off, out of the port of LA on trains and then dropping it off, and then leaving it there for a while because they would have to find other ships to go, of which the Jones Act came up quite a bit in that scenario. So if something is coming from abroad into the port of LA, could it have instead went across the Panama Canal and gone to Florida, for example? Is that something that could have happened with, without having the Jones Act? But was it happening with the ship, the cargo that was moved outside the port of LA and then needing to be, shipped inside the US? What I'm really trying to get at is what is the downstream effect of things that are coming in from abroad versus things that need to be moved even in emergency situations, intercontinentally or inter state within the United States.
So what the Jones Act says is that foreign ships they can come to U.S. ports, and in fact they can go to multiple U.S. ports. So for example, you can have a ship go from Rotterdam to New York, and then it will go from New York down to Virginia, and then down to say Savannah, and then Florida, and then continue on to a foreign country. Now, what those ships do is they'll drop off, most of their cargo in one of those ports, and they'll move on to other ports and maybe drop off yet more cargo that originated from abroad, or they'll pick up cargo that's meant for export. So the ultimate destination will be a foreign country. What those ships cannot do, what they don't do, is pick up, say, a cargo in New York and then drop it off in Miami, since they're going there anyway. And I think the way to think about this is that we have effectively a conveyor belt along our coasts full of foreign ships. The Jones Act doesn't keep out foreign ships, they're here. It just places a big restriction on what you can do with them and your ability to utilize them. So we have this conveyor belt of foreign ships going up and down our coasts that Americans are prohibited from using for transporting goods domestically. So you would think, there are these ships and they're not full. They're, probably looking for extra cargo, but Americans are prohibited from, say, that ship that say, I'm going to Miami, and someone say, hey, I got some cargo for you. You can take down there. No, they can't do that, even though they do go among American ports. So, I look at this as a missed opportunity to give Americans an additional transportation option. And instead, they're stuck using, trucks and rail to move goods around because we don't use shipping in this country to transport goods because it's so economically unattractive. Typically, ships are only used in this country when there is no alternative. So Jones Act ships basically do two things. They either transport goods to Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, Guam, where trucks and rail are not an option, or they transport their tankers that take refined products from say the Gulf Coast of Florida, which doesn't have pipelines going there, or crude oil from Alaska to West Coast refineries, because again there is no pipeline. So basically, Jones Act ships are used when there's no other option.
Yeah, which is kind of hilarious to me in like one of those like sad tragedy kind of ways or sad comedy kind of ways. Uh, because I was reading Peter Zion's most recent book, of which we were going back and forth on, and one of the things that I already had the seed to reach out to you that got kind of exploded when I was reading that book is the first third of it. He goes into the geography of North America and what's so unique about it, and one of the things he kind of belabors for multiple paragraphs is that the United States has more navigable waterways than any other place in the world, and whole regions combined. And what he continues on with that is how much cheaper it is, economically speaking, efficiency. And I guess the way to look at it is like energy efficient to move things by water versus moving things by rail or road or any of those things, because you can move so much, so much weight can be moved without as much effort because of buoyancy in water and things like that, which is funny because we've actually inverted that because of the Jones Act, where it's more energy efficiency wise it's greater, but actually economically it's once again it's actually inordinately more expensive because there just isn't enough ships to do this. Which once again the port of LA is bottlenecked. We should be able to use both our coastlines and our interstate river and canal systems, but we can't because there's just isn't enough ships, and the ones that are there are old and probably also don't carry as much, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it does strike me as a real missed opportunity. Right in front of me, I actually have a report from the Congressional Research Service, which shows modal shares of U.S. freight. So, what percentage of freight is going by which modes? And trucks, 43% of freight, rail, 27%, barges, which you typically use on rivers, inland waterways, 4%, ships, 2%. And then there's like truck and water at 1%, rail and water at 2%. Um, so very very obvious is that waterborne transport, inland and coastal together, is less than 10% of all U.S. freight moved. This is measured in ton miles, and this is kind of crazy when you stop and think about U.S. geography for a second. As you mentioned, we have an extensive network of inland waterways, rivers. We have the Great Lakes. And then we have, I think something like, I want to say 30% of all Americans live within 100 miles or something of the coast. A lot of Americans live along our coast. So our major cities are along our coast, Boston, Miami, Houston, San Francisco, LA, Seattle, New Orleans. I could come with a whole list, go on and on of all the major cities, and yet we move, relatively little by water. And I think that is a real indictment of the Jones Act, because we've managed to take what should be this massive asset, and we've kind of turned our backs on the ocean as a means for transporting goods. In fact, there's a great book out about maritime policy called The Abandoned Ocean, and it just speaks to that, how we've kind of turned our backs on the sea as a means of moving goods here within the United States.
Yeah, completely. And growing the tent of people who should be caring about this, you don't need to maintenance any road or rail if it's water, right? So it's cheaper to do it, but also it's better for the environment because we can move more, and if we're also paying for new ships, that's going to be cheaper. And the amount that you can move is once again greater. So 43%, I think you said, is how much is done by semis. The thing that I always like to think is there's nothing you touch that hasn't been on a semi at one point, right? So everything gets moved at some point on a semi. If we can cut that down to the last 100 miles, well, now all of a sudden there's less of an issue with the transportation and things like that, and the wear on the roads and the inputs that it takes to build a road, and the emissions from doing that. But then again, once again, like what you said, these ships are old, which I would imagine means they're spewing out far worse issues than anything that we create now. So it's a missed opportunity in a lot of different ways. Um, what
Yeah,
are
it's
some of
definitely,
the? Oh, go
environmental,
ahead.
and you talked about the fact that we don't need to maintain, don't need to repave, our waterways. Um, we need to maintain the ports, and for inland waterways, they and the ports themselves, they require dredging, and we make that artificially expensive also through the Jones Act, because dredging is also subject to the Jones Act, as well as the Foreign Dredge Act of 1906, which prohibits foreigners from helping us with that. And there's also the environmental angle, as you mentioned. And in fact, I think yesterday, the U.S. Maritime Administration on their Twitter account had a trivia question about which is the least environmentally damaging mode of transport, and they point out that according to the International Maritime Organization, it's shipping. When the productive value of the good is taken into consideration, the least environmentally damaging mode of transport is shipping. And yet, we artificially raise the expense of this. We should, try to encourage this, and yet through our policies, we discourage this because, of course, Jones Act ships, as previously mentioned, are very expensive to build. 4 to 5 times more expensive, and then they're very expensive to operate. Roughly 3 times more expensive to operate than foreign ships. So you take ships that are expensive to build, expensive to operate, you reduce the amount of competition through the Jones Act, and the inevitable result is very expensive transportation, which is unfortunate, whether viewed through an economic lens or an environmental one.
Yeah, so many areas. It's so interesting. I like complexity science, and if it's complexity science in data, or applied to data, or economics, or even just environment in general, ecology, it's fascinating how you change one thing and how complex everything else will come from it. And this is an amazing example of that. Uh, what kind of economic and just day to day life does this affect? I know your example with Maine is an interesting one, where they can't get liquefied natural gas. Like, one of the things that's interesting about American ports is how much we're investing in liquefied natural gas, especially with the whole crisis in the Ukraine and Europe, and the pipelines shutting down. The investment into liquefied natural gas ports to ship it abroad seems like it's increasing quite a bit. But it's fascinating that a place like Maine, I believe it's Maine, can't get our own natural gas.
So there are two places. Yes, what you're talking about is the fact that the United States were one of the world's leading exporters of natural gas, and in particular liquefied natural gas. So this is natural gas that is turned into liquefied form. Then you transport it to wherever it needs to go, and then you regasify it. We're one of the world's leading exporters, and thankfully, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the resulting sanctions that were put on Russia, through energy networks into disarray, energy markets into disarray. But the U.S. is able to step up and help compensate for that lack of Russian gas by exporting American gas. So we had dozens of tankers, come last year, scores of them. They would transport American natural gas over to Europe to help to keep the lights on. But what's interesting is because of the Jones Act, we can transport it to Europe. We cannot transport it to other parts of the United States, most notably New England, Boston, and also Puerto Rico. Why? Well, that's because there are no Jones Act compliant tankers that comply with no Jones Act compliant liquefied natural gas tankers. So especially, specialized vessels for transporting bulk quantities of natural gas. Why is that? Why has anyone built a U.S. ship and made it comply with the Jones Act so we can take American natural gas to New England or Puerto Rico? Well, it's because the economics just don't work. To build an LNG tanker overseas, a few years ago, the Wall Street Journal pegged that cost about $180 million. I think today it's more like $240 million. Well, they also point out that to build in the United States, the estimated cost was $700 million. So we had a delta of over $500 million for building a single ship. And then after you build it, you still have to crew it with Americans. And again, we go those higher operating costs. So the math does not work. So no one's ever going to build that ship. So Puerto Rico and New England have to import their LNG. We have LNG coming out our ears, but we can't get it there because there are no ships that comply with it. So last year, for example, Puerto Rico at one point imported natural gas from as far away as Oman, halfway around the world. They import it from Nigeria, from Spain, from Trinidad and Tobago, which is fairly close, but also far more distant places. And meanwhile, we have plentiful supplies, but because of the Jones Act, we can't transport it there. So we've come to this place where we can send LNG to China, we can send it to Japan, we can't send it to Puerto Rico, and that's just an absolutely crazy place to be.
Yeah, talk about yeah. I'm viscerally frustrated by that. Especially, I mean, Puerto Rico gets the shit out of the stick in so many ways from governmental policy, but let's. I don't want to touch that third rail. Okay, unless you want to say something about that.
Yeah, no, I will. So another interesting thing is, so that's an extreme example where you cannot get American energy. We're an energy superpower, and Puerto Rico can't get LNG. But even in cases where the Jones Act ships do exist, because of the distortionary effect of those shipping costs, Puerto Rico still doesn't buy American energy, for things like motor gasoline or oil for refining, diesel fuel. Last year, a colleague and I we looked at some data. Where does Puerto Rico get its energy from? And the overwhelming majority was imported. I think American sources. So we looked at I think diesel fuel and LNG and propane. I believe it was three or four different types of energy, and American sources accounted for like I want to say 5% of what Puerto Rico got. Meanwhile, literally next door is the Dominican Republic, which is foreign, not subject to the Jones Act. They're buying well over half of their energy from the United States. So it has this real disincentivizing effect from buying American energy. And for those that are really interested in place a premium on national security and protecting your encouraging domestic supply chains, that should offend you. But just also from an economic efficiency perspective, this is ridiculous. And what it suggests is that buying American energy is the best deal. It's the most cost efficient way of sourcing your energy. But we've made it so Puerto Rico doesn't do that. So it means higher emissions because the gas or the energy has to come from more distant places. It means that we don't have domestic supply chains, more reliant on foreign sources. And it just means it's costlier. Furthermore, if you want to drill down even more, what's really interesting, last February of last year, February 2022, the same month, that Russia invaded Ukraine, that same month, Puerto Rico was importing Russian natural gas. It went from Russia to Spain, and then from Spain to Puerto Rico. This is crazy. And they were buying. I think one of my colleagues looked at data recently. It suggested Puerto Rico is buying tens of millions of dollars of Russian various types of energy from Russia. So this is nonsensical from an economic perspective. This is nonsensical from a national security perspective. This is not a good place to be. And then it becomes all the more ironic when you consider that the Jones Act is typically justified on national security grounds and for protecting America, and yet it's pushing Puerto Rico to purchase energy from Russia. This is crazy.
Yeah, totally. And the people of Puerto Rico end up having to pay. I mean, they're on an island that's a ways away from a lot of things. They're much closer to Venezuela than they are even to Miami. So it's gonna be more costly to get goods there. But having this premium on top of it is unnecessary. So the folks there are having to pay for more of everything because it takes more of everything to get there. Um, okay, so there's an interesting thing that's happened recently with the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, and it's bringing a lot of manufacturing, critical manufacturing, and well, broadly speaking, I think it's trying to incentivize all manufacturing, but especially with things like semiconductors and all of that, it's bringing it, reshoring it back to the states. So to play the devil's advocate here, why not just try to do that again with shipping? Is that what needs to happen? Or is it need to happen that it's the broader strokes of the law, both the crewing of it and the importation of foreign vessels needs to get relaxed?
Yeah, I think if I were to look at the Jones Act's provisions and try to rank them in order of how damaging they are, I think by far the most damaging aspect of the law is that U.S. built requirement. Um, as I mentioned, U.S. ships are extremely expensive compared to those built abroad. So when we make shipping, or, the purchase of new vessels very expensive, we shouldn't be surprised when the result is you get less shipping, um, and the fleet that you do have is older and less efficient than would otherwise be the case. Um, so Jones Act ships internationally, ships are typically used, 20 to 25 years is a normal lifespan of a ship. I looked at the last, I think, 15 or so Jones Act ships that were scrapped, and the average age at which they were recycled, sent to a scrapyard was around 42, 43 years, something like this. So we have an old fleet. We have a fleet that has declined. Back in 1980, there were 257 Jones Act ships. Today we're at 91. So I think trying to promote a vibrant shipping industry by artificially raising the cost of new ships is a really poor way of going about things. And I suppose there might be an argument for that if, in exchange, we had a vibrant shipbuilding industry, but we don't. Last year there was one Jones Act ship delivered. Well, I should say one ocean-going Jones Act ship delivered, and one on the Great Lakes. That one, the ocean-going one that was built, it took like over 3 years to build, I believe. Overseas, those ships take about a year, maybe a year and a half. Um, uh, and the year before that, I think there were zero Jones Act ships delivered. The year before that, one. In an average year over the last 20 years, there are about three Jones Act ships built. To put that in perspective, a single shipyard in South Korea can build 50, 60, or more ships per year. That's a single shipyard. Meanwhile, all U.S. shipyards combined are at three. Furthermore, I guess another argument you can make is, well, okay, you pay more, maybe we don't get a lot of ships built, but there's value in not being reliant on foreigners for our shipbuilding needs. At least this gives us some, independence in our shipbuilding, but it doesn't. This is a total myth. The ships are heavily reliant on foreign designs. They also rely on foreign components. In fact, that the last Jones Act ship built, every major component was imported, including from China. So the notion that we pay more, but at least we're free of reliance on foreigners is an illusion. We're very much dependent on foreigners, even with the Jones Act in place. So I think this is a terrible bargain. I imagine one other argument one can make is that, okay, it's also good to have shipbuilding in time of war because then you can build new ships. Well, again, ships don't appear overnight. Um, Jones Act ships typically take 2 to 3 years to build. I imagine during a time of war, you could accelerate that somewhat, but it's still going to take a minimum of a year to get this built. So being able to build ships is good. It's also good to have a lot of ships from the get-go if a conflict breaks out. The Jones Act means, or at least the U.S. built requirement means, a smaller and less modern fleet than would otherwise be the case.
Interesting. Um, what would it look like? Like how if let's just say Congress got their act together, and it seems like the only way they can pass things is if they're massive. Um, the amount of bills we pass these days is just less, and they're larger, which is a whole other subject.
Yeah.
But let's just say they all of a sudden wave their pen, and they invest a bunch of money to create new shipyards, but keep the Jones Act in place. How long would that take to actually become practical? Because one of the things with manufacturing of certain things, it doesn't take that long to actually build it. But an example again, going back to liquefied natural gas ports, those are like a multi-year thing to put that together. So I'm curious as to, like, if we were to build a whole bunch of new shipyards, is that like a 2 decade thing to be able to get it to a point to be able to be competing with South Korea? Is that multi
So
generational?
I mean,
What would that look like?
here's the issue: is that you can build the shipyard, but where's the demand going to come from? Because right now the big problem is that, again, a U.S. So right now, a medium range tanker. So this is the type of tanker that is commonly used for transporting refined products like gasoline, jet fuel. Overseas, in Asia, that's about a $45 million ship. The most recent number I've seen to build one in the United States, the current estimate is $185 million. So unless that shipyard, if you build it, it's all well and good, but unless you can get your costs, slash your costs by just a massive amount, by a fourth. Or you need to get your costs down to 75% or 80%, something like this. You can't compete. There's going to be no demand for that product, and that shipyard is not going to do anything. The shipyards that we have right now in the United States, there's 6 or 7 major ones, and what they overwhelmingly do is they build ships for the U.S. Navy, where they have a captive market, and then they build the occasional Jones Act ship. Most of our big shipyards, think Newport News in Virginia or Bath Iron Works in Maine. Um, you look at Huntington Ingalls in Pascagoula, Mississippi. They build 100% for the Navy. That's all they do. Most of those shipyards have not built a commercial ship in decades. So that's the key problem you need to solve there is how do you make them competitive? How do you get them to build ships for a similar cost as what you find overseas? And short of just massively subsidizing it and throwing gobs of money, to the tune of, again, that tanker example, we'd have to subsidize it by, $140 million per ship. Where's the demand going to come from? Where's the incentive to do that? I'll note that a few years ago, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, did a study on basically what would it take to build LNG tankers here in the United States, of which we currently have zero. And they looked at it. They figured that in the entire country there were two shipyards that had the capability of building one of these. But even then, they figured it would take these shipyards 4 to 5 years to build one of these ships, whereas over in Asia, it's more like a 2 year project. And these shipyards admitted, they said, we'd probably have to bring over South Korean workers to oversee things and make sure the work is done correctly because they're the experts. So how the U.S. is such a massive disadvantage. How you turn that around, turn the United States into a shipbuilding power, I just don't see it. Lastly, I'll just note that this is not a recent problem. It's not as though the U.S. is fairly competitive and then diverged from other countries in the past few decades. It's been this way since before the Jones Act was passed. In fact, back in the late 1800s, you can find examples of U.S. ships being anywhere from 25 to 50% more expensive than those built abroad. So U.S. shipbuilding has been very uncompetitive for over a century. This is an ongoing theme, and again, short of just absolutely massive amounts of subsidies, throwing gobs of money at these shipyards, I don't see how that gets turned around.
Yeah, and I would imagine the subsidies would. I mean, 75% of the cost being in subsidies would be insane.
I'll point
The
out, actually,
yeah,
back now I'm thinking of it. The U.S. We used to do a system of direct subsidies to our shipbuilding industry from the late 1930s until the early 1980s. We had something called construction differential subsidies, and as the name kind of suggests, these were subsidies where you would take the differential between the U.S. cost and a foreign cost, and the government would basically cover that spread, that delta, and they would do it up to 50% of the cost of the ship. So we were doing that, and U.S. shipbuilding was still an uncompetitive mess, and there were still shipyards closing. So even with that kind of generous help, or perhaps because of it, U.S. shipbuilding was not in a good place. So I think that's also worth considering for those tempted to say, yeah, let's charge ahead with a subsidy program because we've been there before and it didn't work out too well.
yeah. It's the way that I tend to think about subsidies is they're not sustainable in the way that you're messing with the market enough that it's going to artificially create more. All right, more complexity, like what we're talking about here, in which the true cost of things and the true benefit of things tend to get out of whack. And I think it's a feature, not a bug, of government that it moves slowly. I think sometimes it's actually beneficial to move slowly because then you can kind of see how the trends are happening, and it insulates you a little bit. But in this case, that's actually going to immediately become the detriment because you put a subsidy in place and there's all these problems that come out of it. Well, now the market is reliant on the subsidy, which makes it all the harder to fiddle with or change. Corn just for ethanol alone. Let's talk about just using that as an example is a great complex situation. Now, what if we were to say that one part of the Jones Act you can import ships now? How would you foresee the demand curve changing?
Yeah, I think that there would be a demand for new ships. Um, and there would be, it would affect the economics of shipping. You make shipping less expensive, and demand will rise. So, one example right now, the East Coast imports a lot of their fuel comes from overseas because once they factor in the cost of shipping, it doesn't make any sense to buy American fuel, American energy. So either oil for refining or refined products, like motor gasoline. That will come from abroad. Get rid of the Jones Act, and then, or I'm sorry, get rid of that U.S. built requirement, and you reduce the cost of shipping. Presumably, there'll be more demand they'll make shipping more attractive, increase the demand for, say, American energy. So there'd be a demand for some new tankers to transport energy from the Gulf Coast up to the Mid Atlantic and the Northeast. So that's one thing one can imagine happening. Um, so there will clearly be demand for more shipping. You can imagine new routes emerging. Right now, for example, there are no Jones Act container ships that operate up and down the East Coast. There are no Jones Act ships that go from, say, Houston to the Mid Atlantic or the Northeast. So, get those capital costs under control, and one could potentially see a trade route like that or emerge rather. Um, so yeah, I think there would be increased demand for new ships, and then also there'd be an incentive to recapitalize and modernize the existing fleet. Um, so, like for example, our general cargo ships, I think they average, they're over 30 years old. There are nine of them. So there'll probably be some demand to buy new ships and replace some of those. So between new demand from new trades emerging and the increased incentive to get rid of old ships, yeah, I think there would be an influx of new shipping. The only real debate is what's the quantity? How much are we talking here? I don't have a good sense of that. Because the Jones Act has been around for so long, and U.S. Supply chains have oriented themselves away from shipping. It's hard to immediately say, okay, well, we had these kind of shipping routes before the Jones Act, and maybe those could reemerge because we've been this way for so long. It's kind of a guessing game which new trade routes would emerge. But I can only say there would definitely be more shipping and a demand for more ships to meet that demand, increased demand for shipping.
Yeah,
Oh, and I
that
show. Sorry to
speaking
interrupt, but
again.
also
Go ahead.
we should look at the Great Lakes example. So I'm thinking, here coastal, but I would think there's no reason why the U.S. wouldn't mirror what's happened in Canada. Canada removed the tariff on new ships, and they got an influx of new ships for their Great Lakes fleet. We have a very old fleet operating on the Great Lakes. It's not uncommon to find ships that are 60 years old or more or older in that fleet. So I think there would be a real incentive at a minimum to replace those ships with newer, more efficient ones.
Yeah, and I mean, just well, I mean, this is a complete and utter sidestep, but one of the things I think about a lot is that I live, coastal Lake Michigan, and I go between Chicago, Grand Rapids, Wisconsin. Like, I'll go all up and down there. And like the last time I was in Grand Rapids, not that long ago, I was looking at the map, and like when you're driving a long distance, Google Maps will like zoom you out so you can kind of see like a bird's eye view. And in the shot, I saw right across the lake Milwaukee, Madison, Wisconsin, and Chicago. And I was just thinking, like, man, how amazing would it be to have a ferry? It would take you like 40 minutes to go across this on a ferry. You put your car in here and you can just go right across, as opposed to it taking, I mean, to go from Grand Rapids to, Milwaukee, that's 7, 8 hours maybe, because you have to go all the way around. You have to think about traffic going through two major cities. It's insane. Just the ability to ship things to across that would be amazing. Back in the day, the furniture industry in Chicago was sparked because you could go from the coast of Michigan and ship the logs all the way across to be able to mill them and do all that in Chicago. So the interstate commerce, what would emerge would be interesting because once again, the cost of shipping, in inner waterways is so low when you think about how much it actually costs to move per pound versus a truck or things like that. And being able to, the complexity of this is being able to factor that in and how it would change things is difficult. Like I could envision a day where there's those, I mean, I don't really like the monopolization of Amazon doing everything, but I can envision a day where Amazon all of a sudden has those cheeky little smile checkmark things on barges going down the Illinois Michigan Canal, going from one city to another, or bringing it down south to be able to get to Houston or wherever it need to go. I could easily see that happening, but it's just so hard to see it because we're so centric on road primarily to ship things. What would be different if it wasn't there wasn't that hindrance, and also what would the be knock on economic effects too, because if all of a sudden it's cheaper to ship certain things that are heavier. We talk about wanting to reinvigorate American steel, which I think is slowly happening. But if you were able to ship that on uh, waterways as opposed to what I see all the time on railways, what would that end up happening as a knock-on effect for all manufacturing writ large?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's as you point out, there's a lot of talk about trying to encourage manufacturing in the United States and revitalize it. And I think nothing symbolizes manufacturing more than steel, at least in the minds of a lot of people. And the Jones Act undermines our steel industry. As I mentioned earlier, you want to ship, pellets from Minnesota to steel mills. That has to go on a Jones Act ship, which is less efficient, raises costs. And then actually after you produce the steel and you want to ship it to other parts of the United States, there's the Jones Act tax you have to pay. This isn't theoretical. Back in the 1980s, I believe the U.S. International Trade Commission did a study on the U.S. steel industry and why it was struggling to compete with imports in the western part of the United States. So why Eastern steel producers were having a hard time competing with imports in the Western U.S. And one thing to point out was it explicitly called out the Jones Act, the high cost of shipping to move steel to the Western United States. Because imports, they can use efficient international shipping, but American companies have to use inefficient Jones Act shipping. And after you factor in the cost of transportation, it put U.S. steel at a competitive disadvantage. I'm a free trader. I'm not a big believer in industrial policy and trying to encourage certain industries over others. But I also don't understand why we should be punishing American industries and hindering them in this way. So we want to talk about manufacturing revitalization. I think it should start with revisiting policies like the Jones Act. And as you said, this is transportation. Transportation affects almost literally everything. It's so fundamental, especially in a country the size of the United States. We are a huge country, and distance is a barrier to trade. And overcoming that barrier involves efficient transportation, and we are hamstringing ourselves by crippling ourselves by subjecting us to artificially higher transportation costs through the Jones Act.
Yeah, 100. Yeah, totally. I mean, you're painting that picture quite well. And like personally, one of the things that my political philosophy for the role of government should be focusing on the things that are most essential and foundational. And sometimes it does mean making decisions that you want to spur certain industries because of national security or things like that. And I think something that we've noticed, with COVID and then with Ukraine, and I think is going to continue happening, is the kind of regionalization is the response to the overreaction, I suppose, with every action being an overreaction to globalization. You know, we probably should be focusing on more foundational things like transportation and also energy, which you bring up as well. This is a transportation thing, which then has a knock-on effect of being a manufacturing issue. But then, as you point out again, it has a knock-on effect of being an energy one, because if we want to reduce emissions, if we want to rely more on domestic energy, well, natural gas, we have, a lot of natural gas. Um, why don't we try to spur this type of, development? Like something that I learned quite recently is that the development of the Illinois and Michigan Canal and how giant of a deal that was. Because before, if you were in Chicago and you wanted to transport things along the Mississippi River, you'd have to portage it, which means, you put it onto donkeys or you put
Yep.
it onto wagons and then carry it,
Yep.
pretty much to Joliet. And then once you get to Joliet, you'd be able to, put it down the river and eventually uh, get to the Mississippi. But with the Illinois and Michigan Canal, you now have a complete waterway. And it's so fascinating to me that when we would dig things by hand, it was so important for us to make sure we had this. And now, we've kind of all but abandoned it. I mean, pretty much because of the fact that we don't have any ships to be able to do this. So being able to move energy, being able to move uh, goods, but also let's bring it back to the national security, which is part of what the Jones Act was there in the first place. Is if things really do happen, if there is a global chaos or a global chain chain disruption, which I think personally, especially after reading Zion's book, I think it's going to happen more and more often in the next couple of years before things shaken out and stabilize. Um, Having the flexibility of being able to say, well, let's just ship it through the water. Let's do it, you know, a different means or different mode than we had it going before. And the installation that you get to any shock and any type of system, whatever it may be, and things we probably can't see coming, like if it's a natural disaster or any other type of, you know, catastrophic or unforeseen black swan event.
Yeah, I think basically, U.S. maritime policy should try to do two things. It should, one, try to provide us with efficient waterborne transportation, which should be a massive asset in a country with the geographical disposition of the United States. I think it clearly fails there. The other thing it should do is meet our national security needs. In time of war, we have enough ships and shipbuilding and trained mariners to repair ships for the Navy and transport goods for the military to wherever they're needed, and it's failing there too. In fact, we have a few years ago the U.S. government did a study of how many mariners we would have if a war broke out, a sustained conflict of 6 months or longer, and they said in a best case scenario we'd be 1,800 short of what's needed. Shipbuilding, well, we already went over that. Building maybe 3 ships a year. In recent years, it's been lower than that, 1 or 0 ships per year. Um, and then the fleet, has declined dramatically. And furthermore, the Jones Act fleet, it's kind of a misconception. I think a lot of people assume that in time of war, we could grab all these Jones Act ships and then use them to transport goods for the military. The military doesn't use Jones Act ships, or at least not very often. In fact, they've explicitly stated that in times of conflict, that Jones Act shipping would not be used because, for the obvious reason that if we're transporting goods from the U.S. coast to Hawaii, that who's going to do that if those ships are taken out to be used for the military? So actually, the government relies on non-Jones Act ships that are foreign built but U.S. flagged to transport. That's their primary source of commercial sea lift.
Cool. All right. So jumping in a little bit and expanding on that of what you said,
Yeah,
you know, the things that maritime industry, you know, maritime things
policy.
that Congress or the government
Yeah,
could do to
yeah,
maritime policy. Thank you.
yeah.
Um, so it is kind of what we need then, like all things, which makes it more difficult, a mix of solutions in which we need to be able to import more, but then we also need to, you know, foster the competition of our own shipbuilding. Because that I mean, I do think that would be an interesting or effective way of insulating us is that we need more shipbuilding, but in order to do that, we probably need to be more competitive. So verticals and niches form. So something almost like, you know, Japan as a policy, they did something that's really interesting. Harvard Business Review has an amazing article from I think it's the mid '90s on it about strategic intent, in which, you know, they came to America to learn logistics and they signed all these um, automotive deals and contracts with American manufacturers and automotive manufacturers, you know, in a short run to learn how to tap into the American market, learn how Americans do logistics and manufacturing, and then remove that, and then their industry would be spurred enough to be able to pick it up where it is. Toyota's a great example of this. You know, Toyota manufactures a lot in America, even though, you know, at the time up until more recently, not many American car manufacturers did. So it is the solution a mix of both importing more and fostering the niches more within the maritime industry to be able to build more shipyards? Because, you know, we do want shipyards here, especially for how big we are, but we also know that the only way demand may shift is by importing more. Is that something that you think is a good idea, or is you
Well,
think we relax it, it'll take care of itself or emerge on its own?
I think that, well, first things first, I do think we should get rid of the US built requirement. And I think it's worth recognizing that if we did that, all we would really be doing is bringing the Jones Act in line with our policy for all other transportation sectors. Remember, you don't have to have a US built truck, US built train, um, U.S. built airplane to transport goods. We allow foreign equipment in there. I think that our trucking and rail and aerospace industries are better for that. So I think that that'd be the first thing we should do. They would promote, modernization of the fleet, which is a good thing, both economically and from a national security perspective. It'd be more efficient fleet. And I also think that the competition would be a good thing for the U.S. shipbuilding industry. I don't think that if we got rid of it, that suddenly, or even in a few years, that we would see the U.S. start cranking out big commercial ships. I think that the Asians are just so far ahead of the United States that if finding a competitive niche there would be very difficult. What I do think is perhaps more useful is to think of maybe Europe as kind of an analog for the United States and where we could be. The Europeans don't build big tankers or container ships or bulk ships. That's gone to Asia, but they have carved out niches in other places, like Turkey, for example. They are renowned for their tugboat industry. They're very good at that. The Netherlands are very good at building dredging vessels. Finland is very good at icebreakers. Germany and France build cruise ships. So I think the U.S. could carve out, a niche of its own. And right now they're not incentivized to do that. U.S. shipbuilders are kind of a jack of trades, master of none, kind of all over the place. I also think that if we got rid of the U.S. built requirement, it would improve the competitiveness of U.S. shipbuilders uh, because they would get better access to foreign inputs. So, for example, a few years ago, a shipyard in Washington State built a fishing vessel and $75 million shipping vessel. They use a Norwegian design, I believe, lots of imported components, and it was top of the line. But after it was built, they discovered that too much of the steel used in building it was imported. Now, under the Jones Act, you can use foreign steel if it comes in standard shapes and sizes, but you can't form it or bend the steel in another country and then bring it in. Or you're allowed a maximum of like 1.5% of the ship's weight can be foreign bent steel. Well, it turned out this ship used like, I want to say like 8%, something like that. Came from the Netherlands. It was bent. Um, and so there actually had to be an act of Congress passed to give an exemption to this ship so they could be used in American waters, because otherwise they're going to have to sell the ship at a big loss to some foreigner somewhere because it couldn't be used in the United States because it had too much foreign steel. That's crazy. Something that the Norwegians do and others, I think the Dutch, to try to stay competitive, is they do some outsourcing. So they will outsource construction of the hull of the ship to a shipyard in, say, Poland or Croatia or Bulgaria, someplace like this, and then they'll bring the hull over to Norway or the Netherlands, and they will assemble the hull and then do all the outfitting, which is taking all the high-end components and the engine, things that actually make the ship work, and doing all that installation there. If you tried doing that with, say, Mexico, setting up the whole assembly in Mexico, then bring it to the U.S. and doing all the outfitting in the U.S. shipyard, that ship would not be Jones Act compliant. You could not use that ship in the United States. So I think it would help with that. If we made shipping cheaper, that means we would have more ships going up and down our coast, which means there'd be more opportunities to repair ships, which would also be very useful. So there's some new potential business for American shipyards to repair those ships going operating in American waters. So I think shipbuilding would definitely look different without the Jones Act in place. But I reject the notion it would disappear, or because if you believe that, you're essentially saying Americans are good enough. Americans can't compete. Americans have nothing to offer the world in the absence of the Jones Act. I just don't believe that. I have more faith in the American worker, in the inventiveness and the competitiveness of American companies, and I don't think they need protectionism to have a presence in the global shipbuilding world. I'll add that. So as I said, I don't think we would build huge merchant ships, but if people make a convincing case that we need that for national security, then I think the government should just order more ships. Right now, we have what's called the Ready Reserve Force. These are government-owned ships. There are 40 some of these ships, and they average around 45 years old. They're old ships. Some of them are still they use steam propulsion. Uh, as opposed to
Seriously?
modern, diesel. Yeah, and in fact, it's difficult finding the guy, qualified personnel who can operate on these types of engines because they're so out of date. Um, so there's an
It's like
opportunity
using
here. Hey,
mainframe computers on critical
right,
infrastructure.
it's crazy
That's
stuff, and
outrageous.
this is what's supposed to be used to transport equipment for the military in times of war. So if we need to guarantee more business for our shipyards, so they stay in business, so we have these shipyards available, the government should write a check and buy some more ships and buy it from these shipyards. There's an opportunity right there to keep these guys in business if that's what national security demands. So I think there are much more creative ways of going about things than the Jones Act, which again, I don't care if you look at this from an economic perspective or a national security perspective, it's not meeting the country's needs. We don't have efficient waterborne transportation. Our commercial shipbuilding industry is a shell of what it was. We don't have enough mariners, and we have a shrinking and aging fleet. So I think that all those facts demand a complete reevaluation of U.S. maritime policy.
Yeah, you make such a great case for this. One of the things in my day job of consulting and building software for companies, if it's a digital transformation, or I do a lot of work in emerging tech. So right now I do a lot of work with Web3 and machine learning. But one of the things I always point out is the areas that a company is leaving money on the table. And the way that I like to put it is, hey, you have such an opportunity right here. You're leaving money on the table by not investing in this. And this is such an amazing example of how much opportunity there is. It's like if you're telling me like one of our greatest assets, I mean, our greatest asset as America is our geography. Like there's no doubt about that. Like our resources, the fact we go from coast to coast, the fact we have such a diversity of ecosystems and natural resource reserves, it's astounding. And one of the biggest aspects of that when it comes to transportation we're leaving on the table, which is just it's just crazy to me. And I think the point you brought up of if it's trucks, if it's rail, if it's aerospace, relaxing this requirement, we just put it at par with every other mode of transportation, which is interesting because it's the equivalent of saying you have to build the car all in America, and if you make the body panels and the fenders somewhere else, you can't put it on that car and sell it in America. Is absolutely crazy. Um,
I
is there
just
any moment? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, here's another way of kind of framing this or thinking about it. Um, there's a quote by the economist Henry George. It says, "Protectionism teaches us to do in times of peace what our enemies would do to us in times of war." And you think about that and you apply it to the maritime industry. Um, Jones Act supporters will often cite China as a reason to maintain the Jones Act because if we get rid of the Jones Act, then we basically cave to China, or it's a bulwark against Chinese expansionism. Well, I think about it like this: if China really wanted to sabotage the U.S. maritime industry, they would get together with every other country and say, "Guys, please do not sell the Americans any ships. Let's just do a big international embargo on the Americans and don't give them access to your shipyards, to your know-how, and to your more efficient vessels." But of course, the Chinese don't have to lift a finger because that's exactly what we've done to ourselves. So again, it's crazy policy. It's counterproductive. It doesn't pass the smell test.
I really love that quote, by the way. I'm going to use that and think about that. The protectionism quote. Um, is there any momentum in one way or the other? Like, is there any momentum to revoke this? Is there any momentum to keep it in place? And in either case, why is there momentum, and does it have something to do with the fact that we seem to only be able to pass massive bills and not make incremental advancements or improvements anymore as far as the national Congress?
Yeah, so the state of play with the Jones Act right now is it's interesting. We've seen both more criticism, I think, than ever of the Jones Act. My colleague Scott Lincecum at Cato, he had a piece published in the Atlantic, I think 2 weeks ago, about the Jones Act and the cost it imposes. And the Atlantic reached out to him and asked him to write it because obviously this is an issue they find of interest and of relevance. Literally yesterday's Boston Globe had an op-ed about making the case for trying to improve the country's environment by eliminating red tape. And the author specifically called out the Jones Act as something that um, it degrades the environment and has they look at it more specifically through the prism of offshore wind and the obstacles that the Jones Act presents to the deployment of offshore wind. But again, there's that recognition. We saw last year after Hurricane Fiona hit Puerto Rico, there were, I believe, 10 members of Congress who called for a 1 year suspension of the Jones Act for Puerto Rico. These tend to be members from Puerto Rican diaspora, including like AOC, for example. She joined in on that call. And then also last year we saw Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania. He introduced legislation that would have waived the Jones Act for the transportation of LNG that we discussed earlier in this conversation because he recognizes how crazy this is and Americans can't get access to American energy. Senator Ted Cruz did the same thing. Um, and we've seen Representative Ed Case of Hawaii introduce legislation to exempt the non contiguous states and territories from the Jones Act because he recognizes the harm that it causes. So we've seen there's been definitely more chatter about it. We have seen a variety of members of Congress from across the political ideological spectrum identify the Jones Act as a problem and even introduce legislation to address it. But on the other side of the coin, we've also seen a really relentless focus by the Jones Act lobby to keep this law in place and to fight any efforts to pare it back. In fact, last year, we had this interesting example after Hurricane Fiona hit Puerto Rico. There was a demand for diesel fuel in Puerto Rico because the electrical system was degraded, went out of service. So a lot of people turned to generators. They need diesel fuel. Well, there happened to be a foreign flagged ship going from Texas on its way to Europe with 300,000 barrels of diesel fuel. So that ship diverted to Puerto Rico so it could offload its diesel there in Puerto Rico. But then, of course, there's the Jones Act. This was a foreign ship going from Texas to Puerto Rico. So it couldn't offload its cargo without a Jones Act waiver. After several days, the Biden administration eventually granted that waiver, but the Jones Act lobby was furious about this. Um, and during last year's National Defense Authorization Act, there was language of, this is a bill that was over 1,000 pages. And there are a few paragraphs slipped in there that said, in the future, Jones Act waivers, any waiver can only be for a ship that is empty of cargo at the time the waiver is granted. It was very much a specific reaction to this waiver to ensure that that kind of waiver could not happen again, because again, this was a ship that already had the diesel loaded. So if another hurricane were to hit Puerto Rico today or later this year, and there happened to be a foreign ship going by with the fuel that Puerto Rico needs, it could not offload it there. It would have to unload its cargo, then go to American port, then pick it up, then go to Puerto Rico. So it actually made it more difficult for Americans to help in times of emergency. And this kind of speaks to the overall political dynamic. Again, this was a big bill. I imagine very few members of Congress read it from start to finish. Probably didn't even know this provision was in there. But the Jones Act special interests were able to get that in there. This is basically a must pass piece of legislation. It literally funds the military. And there you go. And here we are.
Wow. Where's the money in this lobby? Like I couldn't imagine that this is a very. I mean, they seem very influential, but I mean,
It's it,
how?
it's a
What's
couple
their
things.
incentive?
Yeah, it's a couple things going on here. So number one is that there's a lot of groups that have an interest in maintaining the Jones Act. Um, it is obviously the shipbuilders because they this law says you have to buy what they make. So we have the Shipbuilders Council of America, for example. It means that obviously the vessel operators, the people operating Jones Act ships, they want to maintain this law in place. They want to keep out the foreign competition. It means that the people that crew these ships, which tend to be unionized, um, so you get the AFL-CIO on board with this, and all the smaller unions, the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association, the Seafarers International Union, the Masters Mates and Pilot Union, um, et cetera, et cetera. So you get we talk about the Great Lakes. There's something called the Lake Carriers Association. You go, it's called go to their website, lcaships.com. They have a section of their website devoted just to the Jones Act and why we need to maintain it. So they are here in Washington every day. They're on Capitol Hill making the case. They explicitly state that it's their mission to reach out to every member of Congress and make the case. And meanwhile, there's no countervailing lobbying force out there. There's no organization that's explicitly dedicated to opposing the Jones Act and getting rid of the Jones Act. Whereas, in contrast, I can think of a dozen organizations out there that maintain the Jones Act is, if not the number one priority, it's like a top three priority. So it's a very asymmetric dynamic. And kind of the last thing I'll leave you with to help explain the status quo, why things are the way they are. I think it was last year, the year before, Matt Iglesias tweeted something about the Jones Act. Why can't we get rid of this? What are the dynamics? And somebody responded and said, I used to be a staffer for a member of Congress from, I think, Appalachia. And we would get these Jones Act lobbyists come to us and, they donate. And the only thing they ask is they say, hey, every 6 or 8 years that a bill comes up to do something about the Jones Act change, just vote no. That's all we ask. We're not asking you to introduce legislation or be proactive and go out and do something. Just if a bill happens to come up, vote the right way. That's it. So, the dynamics are this. If you are Representative Case of Hawaii, or some of these other members that I mentioned, or Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who has introduced Jones Act repeal legislation. You introduce those bills, you just made yourselves a bunch. You made yourself a bunch of enemies, people that will oppose you and try to get you fund your opponent and make sure you don't have much of a political future. And your odds of success are dim. It's a really tough issue to win on. Meanwhile, if you support the Jones Act, the number of people that will come into your office and say, "How dare you support the Jones Act?" is very minimal, and you get endorsements, you get cash, you get votes. The incentives are skewed, tilted very much in one direction. And we're talking about the Jones Act, but I could apply this to any number of issues where this dynamic holds, and that goes a long way to explaining why things are the way they are.
What a great encapsulation of the state of play, like the complexity of the status quo, and how you have a small group of people who are dedicated to just a single thing. They put it in plain terms, and they only ask certain things from it, and then that's it. And it's such a, like you said, it's a great state of play for so many other issues that don't have the political capital of an opposing force to just dismantle it. So hopefully just disseminating the knowledge like you've been doing, like on this episode and also in the blog posts and all your work at the Cato Institute. Hopefully more folks will understand this hindrance, and put some pressure on people, because if democracy works best if everybody's well informed, and if everyone's well informed, then that kind of it's e pluribus unum, right? Like it's it's just we're all better than the sum of our parts. So um yeah, thank you again for taking the time. It's been great chatting with you again, and the work that you're doing for the Jones Act, and breaking down this complicated, a bit obtuse thing that's old, that seems like it's, oh well, come on, that can't be that bad, but actually the knock-on effects are terrible, and only seems to be increasing as the fleet size within the U.S. is shrinking, and maybe the polarity in this case could lead to some incremental change. We can be hopeful, I guess.
Yeah, well, thank you again for the opportunity to talk about this. I hope we're able to do it again, maybe in a year or two, and come back with better news about the state of play and where things
Yeah, that'd
stand.
be great. That would be great.